that, I will have to put on a time limit. But I think that will ensure that everybody gets a good chance to contribute. Sir David Davis to move.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I'll do my absolute best to stay inside your guidance. I know that we've got 24 applicants for this, which I think is a record, and so forgive me if I don't take interventions. Indeed, nearly 100,000 people signed petitions relating to these subjects, and I'm pleased to say they'll have their voices heard in this chamber today. Now, the debate about how best to cater for those with special needs is often dominated by hard numbers, money, places, head counts, and so on. That's obviously a vital part of the discussion, but the real heart of the matter is the human impact and the children and families behind the figures. My part of the world, East Riding, has the lowest per capita funding in the country, about a third of the highest. And I will declare an interest here, more than an interest, a prejudice. I have a grandchild of my own who suffers from something called SYNGAP1, which is a genetic disease which makes her non-verbal, gives her daily fits and seizures, and so she has a very high intensity of requirement. But last year, in the 2 years of COVID, she missed 40 days of teaching over and above the lockdown requirements because of lack of resources. 8 weeks of schooling lost to a child that needs continuity and stability, and it causes enormous distress. So you can see immediately how this has an effect. Chloe, her name, has complex needs, and meeting those needs is a daily challenge for parents, for teachers, and so on. For her to miss so much school is simply awful and puts huge pressure on Chloe herself and the rest of her family. But the point is, important as that is to me, her case is not unusual. Many of her classmates have and continue to have the same experiences, and thousands upon thousands of children across the country face the same. Parents, teachers, teaching assistants, mental health workers, carers, a host of others do incredible work to ensure these children get as much help as possible. But they're struggling to provide adequately for everyone. At the moment, the resources are simply not there. And a bit of background here is important. Education, health and care plans, the EHCPs as they're known, were effectively introduced in 2014. It's a well-intentioned reform that sought to provide holistic support for young people in need. But what the reforms failed to do is to provide resilience in the system to deal with future changes to demand for services. And in recent years, there's been a huge increase in that demand. Population growth, better detection of conditions like autism, longer life expectancy because of medical progress, all put pressures on the system. As a result, the total number of EHCPs and statements of special need has more than doubled since 2015, a rise of more than 250,000 cases, with large increases in every age group. But the funding from central government has simply not kept pace. Part of the answer here is updating the funding formula, of course. The existing allocation of funds is based on an out-of-date assessment of each area's special education needs. And of course, some level of differentiation of funding makes sense. Not every area has the same needs. For example, rurality has a huge impact, as staff campaigners and families in my area know only too well. These national pressures lie behind the call by the F40 group, representing local authorities with some of the worst rates of SEND funding, for 4.6 billion additional funding from the central government. And that figure is based on that huge growth in number of EHCPs local authorities have to support, as well as significant inflationary pressures. Each EHCP, tailored to specific needs of a child requiring additional support, costs the authority cash. So the more EHCPs that are needed, the more local authorities have to cough up, and the greater the pressure on already tight finances. Remember, in the past 2 years, 6 local authorities have already declared themselves effectively bankrupt. The impact of these pressures on SEND provision is clear for all to see. In 2022, less than half of EHCPs were issued within 20 weeks of application. In other words, 1 in 2 children waited more than 5 months. Now think, 13% of children are special needs. So that's a huge number of kids waiting for help. And many have to wait a lot longer to get the support they need. In some cases, Children had to be sent to schools far away due to the lack of local places, and families struggle over and above their normal needs to get appropriate support. Parents and carers have supplied me with many illustrative examples. One, Jennifer, said, "We have been on a waiting list for 22 months for my son to see a speech and language therapist. The lack of SEN schools needs addressing as a matter of urgency as their children are being locked down and suffering." Another, Esther, said, "My son hasn't had his EHCP met in 4 years in a special needs school. He has not had speech therapy for over 3 years, nor has he had physio, occupational therapy, sensory or educational needs met. There is urgent need for more funding, and SEN schools can have appropriate class sizes with therapists and enough qualified and skilled support staff." In the words of one special needs specialist teacher, Louise, "Services such as speech and language therapy have been reduced dramatically. In my autism spectrum condition resource provision class, we used to have 3 hours a week. Now we have 3 hours a half term." There was another teacher, Catherine, put it, "We have large numbers of children who require specialist support to allow them to thrive and stay safe. But due to a lack of resources, other children are receiving minimal support, and we are firefighting just to keep the children safe." And of course, the financial impact of this, to come to the numbers, is enormous. The cumulative deficit in local authority high needs budgets is estimated to be 2.3 billion, and is expected to reach 3.6 billion by March 2025. There are more than 80 local authorities with large high needs deficits. Now, currently, these deficits are being held off local authority balance sheets by a statutory override. That override is time limited, and it will expire in 2026 if it's not extended. Now, if and when it does expire, many councils will be bankrupted overnight, with huge implications not just for education, but for all local services. That's why the F40 group consider the expiry to be a sword of Damocles hanging over the entire sector. 55 local authorities have had to sign up to the government's Delivering Better Value in SEND programme, and 34 to the Safety Valve programme. Both of these basically set up with the challenge of dealing with the rising demand and costs. In other words, almost 90 authorities have had to go to the government for help already. Of course, it's also crucial that we are able to plan for future challenges so we can meet them when they arise, rather than constantly firefight with limited resources. To that end, there needs to be a substantial increase in capital funding to allow local authorities to invest in SEND projects. The recent announcement of 2.6 billion, I say to the Minister, is very welcome, but more is needed. Without the start-up cash, we'll simply find ourselves in another crisis in 5 years' time. Now, these might sound like big numbers, and we all know these are straitened times for the economy after COVID. But in reality, failing to invest is a false economy. We might save some money in the short term, but long-term costs, both to the budgets and to the children concerned, are huge. Let's take an example. A child suffering from poor physical and mental health, suicidal ideation, poor school attendance. He spent a lot of time refusing to engage at all. Special needs staff set out an action plan, gave him one-to-one mentoring support, thrice weekly pastoral sessions, regular counselling, and organised work experience for him. The result? His school attendance improved, he began to develop friendships with peers, and he was able to manage a full school timetable. His life was transformed. The reverse scenario, however, happens all too often. As Mo, a speech and language therapist, put it, it is widely acknowledged that early intervention is key. However, due to a lack of funding, staffing levels and subsequent long waiting lists, we're unable to provide it. A child might, say, have autism and anxiety and be struggling to get into school and struggling to cope with a day's work. Without help, those things get worse. They come to school less, they find it harder and harder to do basic tasks, their friendships suffer, and it'll be harder then for special needs staff to get through to. Ultimately, they'll need a much greater and more expensive effort to reintegrate them into schooling and require much greater long-term care. Intervening early is transformative, and that requires the resources to act before problems spiral out of control. Now, one further problem, of course, is the severe workforce difficulties that SEND employers face. Specialist teaching assistants, for example, now cost employers £24,000 each, roughly. That's up from about £16,000 10 years ago. But the place funding has not changed from then to now, from £10,000 a child. So we're not matching that extra demand. Many SEND workers will be better remunerated in less skilled jobs. In a challenging economic climate, they may be forced to vote with their feet. One therapist, Hayley, said she had seen a huge decline in skills and knowledge of the workforce. And that won't come as a surprise to anybody dealing in this sector. Now, of course, ministers say they value the work SEND staff do, but this has to be backed up by funding. Otherwise, the workforce will continue to dwindle, with dire consequences for those who rely on them for support. Now, there are many other aspects, Madam Speaker, and I know you want me to be sharp, so I'll not deal with most of them. These challenges extend to further education. Young people aged 16 to 25 make up 27% of those EHCPs, and I know some of my colleagues here will want to touch on that aspect. And as I said, it's not simply a matter of funding. Just this week, the Under-Secretary of State for Justice recognised the need for systemic reform because families were waiting between 9 and 13 months for hearing after appealing against EHCP decisions. Now, I'm sure some of my colleagues in the House could go into these issues in their speeches and will raise their own experiences of helping families in their constituencies. And just as I may mention that my right honourable friend, the neighbour, the member for East Yorkshire, who cannot be here this afternoon, agrees with all of these points, but he has to be in his constituency. But members of the front bench too, who cannot contribute to this debate, also have their concerns. I know, for example, the member for Banbury, like many others, has been contacted by many constituents on this subject and taken their worries on board. And there are other ministers too who don't particularly want me to mention them, but who have the same concerns. I can't think why. The bottom line is that the support the society provides for its most vulnerable is a measure of its compassion and, in my mind, a measure of its civilization. That's the key. And I'm sure the government shares these principles, but now we must find a way to deliver the change to make them a reality.
The question is, as on the order paper, Gareth